Greetings. It's been long overdue, at least in my mind, for me to have done a language-related video, a video covering language-related topics. And I do indeed have a small sub-population in my subscriber base that takes an interest in these sorts of things. And I am always pleased to make videos that do not cover topics explicitly dealing with, well, gender relations. So here we are again, and I am going to be talking about dialects, sociolects, and standardized versions in this video. Now, this video won't be too technical for a number of reasons. I want to keep it relatively short, and I want to make it comprehensible to most people. Now, most people, of course, have heard of the term dialect, and I reckon fewer people have heard of the term sociolect. They're actually distinct things. And then we have standard language. So let's begin with dialect. When people think of dialect, they usually think of some sort of other variant of a language they're familiar with. And since most people are monoglots, they tend to think of some other variety of English. They might think of Cajun English in the United States as some sort of dialect, or Southern English as some sort of dialect, etc. Technically speaking, that is in the sociolinguistic sense, a dialect is a variety of a certain language that is bound by geographical lines, which is to say, dialects almost always are limited to a certain region, which is to say, once again, the so-called Southern twang in the United States that you're more likely to encounter in the South than anywhere else is a variety of English, and certainly not uniform, but a variety of American English that deviates from standard American English and is found almost exclusively in the southern states of that country. Likewise, a Geordie, someone hailing from the north of England, say from Newcastle, is going to be, in all likelihood, speaking some variety, some dialect of English that is concentrated in the north of England, say Newcastle or any of those areas around that city. That is, in an official sense, what a dialect is. And then we have something called sociolects. A sociolect can often be confused with a dialect, and there does seem to be crossover. But the difference between a sociolect and a dialect is that a dialect is, once again, bound by geographical configurations and lines. A sociolect has different sorts of boundaries. It has different limes, or limits, to itself. These limits and boundaries are almost always exclusively based on race, ethnicity, social class, economic class, etc., which means that a sociolect can appear to be a dialect, but in fact it can span vast areas of geographical regions, as opposed to a dialect which is limited to a very specific geographical region, even if that is a large area, such as the south of the United States, southern states. By contrast, by way of contrast, a sociolect seems to be a dialect, but in fact is found across the board in a certain type of person, socioeconomic class, etc. So, citing the southern twang, if you will, as some variety or dialect of standard American English, you could look at, let's take a look at two different kinds of phenomena that are described as sociolects. In African American English, also called African American vernacular, you often have what's called a copula deletion. Now, copula is a somewhat fancy way of referring to the to be verb in linguistics. A copula is an is, an are, a be, etc. And it's quite a prominent feature in African American vernacular to have copula deletion, or dropping the copula, such as he crazy, or where you at, or she working, as opposed to she is working, she working, etc. Now, this is not regionally based, but you'll find it in almost all varieties of Black American vernacular, because you'll find it in LA, you'll find it in New York, you'll find it in Detroit, etc. So it's a universal feature of a specific socioeconomic class, and that's why we call this a sociolect. So Black vernacular English as opposed to being a dialect, is classified as a sociolect. Alternatively, in the UK, I've talked about this before, the phenomenon of TH fronting. That is, when you have what we traditionally call a dental a dental fricative, a th sound, in words such as with or through or thumb, which is then turned into an F sound, which is called a labiodental fricative. You can see this as I'm presenting them. A f sound, so whiff or fum as opposed to thumb, etc. Now, at some point in time, earlier, actually up until recently, the TH fronting phenomenon was really limited to the London locality, and areas around its suburbs. So it was a dialectical feature. But it's become a sociolectical feature over time because millennials in particular and people of relatively young age are beginning to employ this change, this phonological change, across the board in places as far away as Manchester and as far away as Newcastle upon Tyne, all the way up north. You'll find many people, many young people, youth essentially, engaging in TH dropping or TH fronting practices. I've heard this myself with people I game with online, people who are not from London, people who are from the Midlands or other areas of the UK, saying things like whiff, fum, fru, and things like that. So it's possible to have something that was once a dialect over time turn into a sociolect. And this, I think, TH fronting now has become much more of a sociolectical feature than a dialectical one, although, of course, it still has dialectical status. I mean, it originated in the London area, Cockney, and yeah. The other thing which you might consider a feature of this is something that's not related to pronunciation so much as syntax. I've noticed frequently, well, one feature of Cockney is to say you was as opposed to you were. That is, to make no distinction in the imperfect or the simple past of the verb to be. That is, I was, you were, we were, etc. I was, you was, etc. And in this case, I've seen this feature transmit itself to other parts of the UK as well, once going hand in hand with this TH fronting phenomenon. So you can have crossover and things can become sociolects over time. Now, most people also recognize that there is a standard language that seems to represent, if not a majority of speakers, the standard to which most people adhere, certainly in the higher echelons of society. And a standard language, a standard variety of a language, is in fact a dialect. It's a dialect that won the political, military, and economic lottery, if you will. For example, there's a reason why so-called estuary English, southeastern English in the UK, tends to be the variety of British English regarded as the standard, the gold standard, still to this day. Although there's so much variety apart from that, it is regarded as quote-unquote standard British English. And this has to do, as I've just stated, almost entirely to do with economic and historical circumstances, political circumstances. London, for untold centuries, was the epicenter of political power, of economic power, etc. And what you get as a result of that is a dialect that is then accorded official status, which doesn't mean that it's superior in any real sense. It just, once again, is a winner in a lottery of political and economic vying over time. And so, in this case, Southern Estuary English, the southeastern variety of British English, tends to be regarded as the standard even to this day. And most people think of British English, they think of that. The same could be said for Parisian French. Parisian French was the origin of what's commonly referred to as standard French these days, at least within the confines of France. And even in countries, and I'll get to this in a bit, that were not united up until fairly recently, such as Italy, you also have this effect. Modern Italian is based on the Florentine dialect that was canonized essentially by prestigious literary authors such as Dante, Petrarch, and Boccaccio, usually sometimes referred as the three crowns. I believe in Italian the term is tre coroni. I might be wrong about that. But these gentlemen helped to canonize the literature of Italy, the vernacular as opposed to Latin, and specifically their variety of Italian. And later came, of course, the Medicis and then the Florentine banking concerns and what have you. And there you have it. You have this economic and literary powerhouse behind a certain dialect, and it becomes the gold standard of Italian. All the while, there remain a host of different dialects, and it's a very interesting issue pertaining to Italy, alongside this dialect that achieved ascendancy due to literary prestige, prominence, as well as economic influence of the city of Florence. Now, dialects, of course, are often viewed as in sort of poo-poo terms. Objectively, there's no real reason to view them as such. But standards are established primarily as a means of making communication relatively uniform. Too much deviation from a standard can lead to miscommunication and the inability to communicate across borders. Now, I just mentioned Italy, and it's interesting because the number of dialects, the number of presence of dialects, the presence of dialects is often related to the age of a country. Now, age of a country, I'm not referring to the geological age. That's absurd. I'm referring to the age in a political sense, in a historical sense. Countries that are relatively young have, by way of comparison to their older cousins or brothers, fewer dialectical varieties. And nowhere is this more acute or present, I would argue, than in the Anglosphere or the Anglo-Saxon realm. So if we look at three different countries, the United Kingdom, the United States, and Australia, we see different phenomena. The United Kingdom is a very, very old country compared to both the United States and Australia, and you find just tons of variety in terms of dialects and some sociolects as well. You have the Mancunian, the speaker of the Manchester variety, the Geordie up in the north in Newcastle upon Tyne, speaking his variety. You have different dialects in Scotland, Glaswegian. You have Liverpoolian. You have the dialect of Cornwall, etc. And it's just massive. And a lot of this has to do with just the age of the country. There was also never in the UK, and I'll get into this in a bit, a concentrated effort in sort of wiping out dialectical variety. So yes, whilst London was the epicenter, and by dint of that, as a consequence, you had the Southern Estuary English rise to prominence as the standard variety of English. The rest of the counties and areas of the UK still had their dialects in a state of flourishing because, well, there was no systematic attempt to wipe them out. There was no systematic attempt to unify the language. Now, if we contrast that with the history of France, which is, once again, a very old country, by way of comparison to newer countries, of course, and interestingly enough, also has a relatively old crown. The King of France was around for centuries before, say, the unification of Germany and Italy, respectively, in 1871, something to get into in a bit. Pardon me. And what you see there as a way of contrast to the UK is a systematic attempt by the crown to sort of turn French into a uniform unit. What we used to refer to as Provençal in medieval literature is all but gone, and a lot of this has to do with the centralization of authority seated in Paris. And you still find variety in France, but it's nowhere in the numbers that you find, say, in the UK in terms of variety. because over time French became pretty uniform due to the consolidation of power and also the exercise of that power in an active attempt to extirpate other varieties that were deemed essentially subversive to the crown. Much of, say, cultural identity, if you will, can be tied to the local variety of the respective language. And in the case of France, historically, the desire to sever people from their local dialect was also the desire to put them under the authority of the crown. If everyone's speaking the same language, they have no recourse to their own unique variety. And it was quite effective. You generally don't find that much variety in France compared to countries such as Italy, Germany, and the UK. But getting back to the point at hand, relatively young countries have fewer varieties. So if we move from the United Kingdom to the United States, we find far fewer varieties. You do find varieties in the United States. For example, there are vast swaths of the United States where you find the so-called cot-cot merger. Notice I do not possess this feature. That's not a feature of my English. But I would say the majority of people, starting somewhere in the Midwest all the way out to the West Coast, do not distinguish between the vowels in the words caught and cot. That is to say, they say, I caught a fish and I was resting on the cot. Whereas I would say, I caught a fish and I was resting on the cot. So these are, of course, distinctions, and they can be seen as dialectical distinctions. And of course, you have the southern variety, the southern twang, if you will, etc. But you don't find the same variety you do in the UK, where you can travel a few hundred kilometers or even 100 kilometers, and you're hearing something rather quite different. And all of this has to do with the youth of the country. You had only a few types of representatives who were settling the country, colonizing it, and as a consequence, you didn't have the number of dialects to begin with. And of course, with modernization, with modern means of communication, you get a welding, if you will, a solidification of a standard much more quickly. Modern media, I've remarked in the past, have contributed a great deal to the solidification of specific varieties and standards, and that's certainly true in the United States. But if we turn now to Australia, which is an even younger country, you find even less variety. You generally don't find too much dialectical variety. In Australia, you're much more likely to encounter sociolectical variety. That is to say, the high-end wealthy man of Sydney is going to speak a different English to the bogan in the outskirts of Sydney, or even the bogan in the north of the country near Darwin, etc. But these are not really dialectical features so much as they are sociolectical features. These are features that are primarily based on economic status and consequently social status. It's unlikely, for example, that someone of similar social status in Perth will speak a very different variety, or even a minorly different variety from a variety you would encounter in Sydney of someone of identical social status or economic status. And this has a lot to do with the age of Australia. Australia is an even younger country than the United States, and it just didn't have the time to expand upon all these possibilities for dialectical development. And of course, given the modern age we live in, and social media, etc., that's unlikely to ever happen anytime soon. But generally in Australia, when you compare, say, differences based on social status or economic status, you tend to hear a much more mild variety of what you would traditionally call the Australian accent. The crocodile Dundee with his crocodiles and that sort of thing. You're not likely to hear that in people of high social status, say in Sydney, Melbourne, any of the wealthier cities. But this has very little to do with dialect, and so we will be moving on. Now, there are other factors that I've already mentioned that contribute to the creation, dispersal, and even destruction of dialects. And a standard language is, of course, just another dialect at the end of the day. For example, if we contrast Italy and Germany to France and the UK, we have different histories. Both France and the United Kingdom had kings, monarchs, from a very early point in time, centuries going back to the Middle Ages. Germany and Italy, for whatever reason, perhaps because they were formerly parts of the Holy Roman Empire, you don't have this. Germany and Italy were not united into a kingdom or a singular country until 1871. And what you had up until then was a series of small kingdoms, principates, duchies, etc. Kingdom of Lombardy, Sicily, the Papal State. In Germany, there was Bavaria, North Rhine-Westphalia, the independent Hanseatic states, etc. And so what you get is this mishmash, and you never really have a standard unifying force, a political force behind it all. Now, of course, these countries are also very old countries, not in the sense of unified, but the presence of people there, of cultures and societies and what have you. These are relatively old countries compared to New World countries such as Australia or the United States or Canada. And so you do find a tremendous amount of dialectical variety in Italy. And of course, in Germany, which I'm much more familiar with, you find a tremendous amount of dialectical variety to the point where someone who's trained, who actually listens to these things, such as myself, I can, 80 to 90% of the time, I can pinpoint the exact origin of a German speaker, or for that matter, an Austrian speaker, based on listening to 2 or 3 sentences he might speak. Now, the German standard is based on Martin Luther's translation of the Bible in large measure. And it is a standard, and people are taught it. It's called High German or Hochdeutsch. This is not to be confused with the idea of this is called High German because it's somehow elevated above other varieties. It's called Hochdeutsch because of the prominence of hills and mountains in the area where it originated. And actually, at the end of the day,